Ukraine, then there will be no harvest, and that will have a long-term effect. So we've got to continue to focus on the humanitarian impacts of the war while looking for a ceasefire and an end to it.
Can I ask a question about the rhetoric? The rhetoric is very harsh right now. Putin has said some very strong things. Biden has been calling Putin a war criminal. I'm sure there's going to be harsh exchanges in the meeting today too. Do you think that is good? Is that going to help? Is that going to make Russia any more cooperative?
I think you're right. There needs to be a balance between calling out Russia's disinformation and lies on this, and that's a pretty harsh thing to do. At the same time, it is encouraging that there's now been 4 rounds of talks. We haven't yet seen a ceasefire, but there seems to be at least progress and willingness to continue those talks. So we want to continue to get that balance right between calling out the disinformation, holding Russia to account, while leaving open the space to bring this awful Russian war to an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Because I'm dead. Okay.
What's going on with the resolution of the GA?
I think we are moving in the right direction. I hope we will be able to adopt it next week, probably not at the beginning of next week. I think we are trying to reach broad consensus, and I think there will be large support for the resolution. It will be a resolution focused on humanitarian issues, humanitarian access, cessation of hostilities, access for humanitarian agencies in respect of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. Before that, tomorrow, there will be a vote on the Russian draft in the Security Council. I think it will not be adopted. And to tell you the truth, this is very much the story of the arsonist's firefighter. So you launch a war, you kill people, you bomb civilians, and then you call for help. So I think this is the reason why this project is not serious, and I think it will fail with a huge majority. And this is why Mexico and France, we will take this initiative to the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you.
أعلن افتتاح جلسة مجلس الأمن
The 8,998th
8998
meeting of the Security Council is called to order.
جدول الأعمال
The
المؤقت
provisional
لهذه
agenda for
الجلسة
this meeting
كالآتي:
is
الأخطار التي
threats
تهدد
to
السلم
international
والأمن
peace and
الدوليين.
security.
أقر جدول
The
الأعمال.
agenda is adopted.
وفقا للمادة
In accordance with Rule
37 من
37
النظام
of the
الداخلي
Council's
المؤقت
Provisional Rules of
للمجلس،
Procedure,
أدعو
I invite the
ممثلي بولندا
representatives of
وأوكرانيا
Poland
إلى
and
المشاركة
Ukraine
في
to
هذه
participate
الجلسة.
in this meeting.
تقرر ذلك.
It is so decided.
وفقا للمادة
In
39 من
accordance with
النظام
Rule
الداخلي
39 of
المؤقت
the Council's
للمجلس،
Provisional Rules of
أدعو
Procedure,
مقدمي
I invite
اللحاقات
the following
التاليين
briefers to
إلى
participate in this
المشاركة في
meeting.
هذه الجلسة: السيدة
Miss
روزماري
Rosemary
ديكارلو،
DiCarlo,
وكيلة الأمين العام
Undersecretary
للشؤون
General
السياسية
for
ودعم
Political and
السلام،
Peace-Building Affairs,
والسيد راوف
Mr.
مازو،
Raouf Mazou,
مساعد المفوض
Assistant High
السامي
Commissioner for
للعمليات
Operations,
مفوضية الأمم
Office of the
المتحدة
United
لشؤون
Nations High
اللاجئين،
Commissioner for Refugees,
والدكتور
and
تدروس
Dr.
أدهانوم
Tedros Adhanom
غبرييسوس، المدير
Ghebreyesus,
العام لمنظمة
Director
الصحة
General of the
العالمية.
World Health Organization.
تقرر ذلك.
It is so decided.
يبدأ مجلس الأمن الآن
The
نظره في
Security
البند
Council will now
2
begin its
من جدول
consideration
الأعمال.
of item 2 of the agenda.
أعطي الكلمة
I now
الآن
give the floor
للسيدة
to Ms.
روزماري ديكارلو.
Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, daily attacks continue to batter Ukrainian cities. Many are reportedly indiscriminate, resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Between 24 February and 15 March, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 1,900 civilian casualties. The total consists of 726 people killed, including 52 children, and 1,174 injured, including 63 children. The actual number is likely much higher. Most of these casualties were caused by the use in populated areas of explosive weapons with a wide impact area. Hundreds of residential buildings have been damaged or destroyed, as have hospitals and schools. OHCHR continues to monitor reports of civilian casualties in the whole country, including in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. OHCHR staff in Donetsk are closely following the developments regarding the 14 March incident in which 20 civilians were reportedly killed by a Tochka-U missile that may have contained cluster munitions. All such instances must be properly investigated. It is the responsibility of all sides to fully abide by their obligations to protect the lives of all civilians everywhere. OHCHR is gravely concerned about reports of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of civilians, local authorities, and civil society activists in Russian-controlled areas. We call for their immediate release. Mr. President, this week there were positive signals reported regarding the ongoing direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives. We welcome all such engagements. However, we note that these signals have so far not translated into the cessation of hostilities that is so desperately needed. The situation in the southeastern port city of Mariupol is particularly alarming. Many of the Mariupol residents who have not been able to safely evacuate lack food, water, electricity, and medical care. Uncollected corpses lie on city streets. Yesterday's strike on the Mariupol theater, which reportedly served as a bomb shelter for displaced civilians, adds to the list of attacks against civilian structures. While early reports indicate that the worst may have been avoided, ongoing fighting is hampering the rescue work and assessment of the situation. Mr. President, the devastation and suffering in Mariupol and Kharkiv raises grave fears about the fate of millions of residents of Kyiv and other cities facing intensifying attacks. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. Civilians are entitled to protection against the dangers arriving from military operations. Direct attacks on civilians are prohibited. Yet, the magnitude of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine cannot be denied. This demands a thorough investigation and accountability. Mr. President, the priority for the UN and its partners is to reach the people trapped by the ongoing shelling, including in eastern Ukraine. To that end, we continue to scale up our operations on the ground as circumstances permit. The needs of the population are growing by the day. The UN calls for safe passage for civilians from and humanitarian supplies into encircled areas. We are grateful to neighboring governments for their generosity in receiving refugees and enabling the provision of assistance to Ukraine. The UN is requesting all donors to fast-track funding against pledges made toward the Ukraine Flash Appeal. The appeal, which seeks $1.1 billion to help 12 million people in need, is 36% funded. Mr. President, UNDP projects that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war continue, setting the country and the region back decades and leaving deep social and economic scars. As the Secretary General highlighted, dangerous ripple effects of the conflict are already being felt across the globe. Russia and Ukraine represent more than half of the world's supply of sunflower oil and 30% of the world's wheat. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted. All of this is hitting the poorest the hardest and potentially creating instability around the globe. The Secretary General announced on 14 March the establishment of a global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance to lead an effort with member states to deal with the complex fallout of the war. The Deputy Secretary General will lead an interagency steering committee with partners to oversee this effort. Mr. President, the Secretary General welcomes all ongoing diplomatic contacts. He remains actively engaged with leaders who are trying to bring about an end to this war. There will be no winners to this senseless conflict. The tremendous loss it is causing, on the other hand, is heartbreakingly clear. And it is going to get much, much worse the longer the fighting continues. The Secretary General urges intensified and coordinated political efforts for an immediate cessation of hostilities. There must be a meaningful, sustained political process to enable a peaceful settlement. The lives of millions of Ukrainians and the peace and security of the entire region and possibly beyond depend on it. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر السيدة ديكارلو
I
على
thank Ms.
إحاطتها.
DiCarlo for her briefing.
أعطي الكلمة
I now
الآن
give the floor
للسيد
to
رؤوف
Mr.
مازو.
Raouf Mazou.
Mr. President, it has been less than 3 weeks since High Commissioner Grandi addressed this council. Within this short time span, the number of refugees from Ukraine in the neighboring countries has risen exponentially from the then 520,000 to over 3.1 million today, in what has become the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. With close to 2 million refugees from Ukraine, Poland has, in a matter of a few weeks, become one of the largest refugee hosting countries in the world. Some 490,000 people have fled to Romania, 350,000 to Moldova, 280,000 to Hungary, and 228,000 to Slovakia. Hundreds of thousands have now reached other European countries. A sizable number of people have also moved to the Russian Federation and to a smaller extent to Belarus. We are humbled by the remarkable resilience of the refugees, many of whom have left their home with next to nothing, and by the extraordinary hospitality of the host authorities and host communities. This solidarity illustrates the very foundation of the international refugee protection architecture and the spirit of the Global Compact on Refugees. The acts of compassion, humanity, and kindness we now witness daily bring hope and brighten an otherwise very grim reality. We strongly commend the governments of receiving countries for keeping their borders open to all those fleeing Ukraine, including third country nationals who must continue to be received without any discrimination. The robust response that these countries have mounted from scratch in an extremely short period of time is truly impressive. We are heartened by the bilateral and other support extended to the principal refugee hosting countries and the funding committed to us so far in support of the $1.1 billion US dollar flash appeal for the response inside Ukraine and for the $550.6 million US dollars towards the UNHCR-led regional refugee response plan, both launched on the 1st of March. The outpouring of support from the private sector and individuals who have jointly provided some 2/3 of the funds raised for the response so far must be lauded. All international support to the response is coordinated under the refugee coordination model led by UNHCR, which has been established in Poland, Moldova, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, as well as in other countries in the region. The sum of collective expertise and support will be critical to help the refugee population and support host countries with shelter, emergency relief items, cash assistance, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. UNHCR has scaled up its response by deploying over 200 experts and established field presence in all countries. UNHCR staff on the ground undertake regular protection monitoring at the main border crossing points, reception centers, and other locations where refugee transit or gather. However, with the current pace of refugee outflows, the capacity of neighboring countries are being tested and stretched. We can and must do more to support, and we must do it now. As the situation evolves, UNHCR, in coordination with the host governments and partners, will assess the needs as necessary and is currently adjusting the regional refugee response plan. While some refugees transit through countries neighboring Ukraine, many also join families which have long settled in these countries. This is particularly the case in Poland, where with time passing and resources diminishing, the number of refugees needing integration will rise. They and the state which hosts them will need support to ensure their inclusion in all sectors of public life, health and education, access to labor and other services. With EU host countries receiving support from the rest of the Union, we are particularly concerned about the situation in Moldova, where over 350,000 people have arrived. This refugee crisis comes on top of pre-existing challenges. It is therefore crucial that sufficient resources are made available quickly to support the government's response. As critical as it is, funding is only one of the many forms of support that are urgently needed. We commend the recent launch of the EU Solidarity Platform, designed to ease the pressure on the countries neighboring Ukraine through transfers of vulnerable refugees to the other EU member states. We are grateful to those member states that have already made concrete pledges to transfer refugees from Moldova and encourage others to join this initiative, which constitutes a remarkable and innovative example of responsibility sharing in line with the key tenets of the Global Compact on Refugees. In addition, the EU activated for the first time in its history the Temporary Protection Directive, which enables refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons to arriving in Ukraine to quickly regularize their legal status, alleviating pressure on asylum systems. It shall also enable refugees to find work, access services, and benefit from social protection. Such temporary protection has also been announced by the governments of the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Brazil, and others. Mr. President, I wish to further highlight that 90% of the refugees fleeing Ukraine are women and children, indicating the heightened risk of gender-based violence and other forms of exploitation and abuse, including trafficking. As the Secretary General said, for predators, human traffickers, and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. We are deeply concerned about media reports of incidents of gender-based violence and trafficking, and are supporting the efforts of government in scaling up prevention and risk mitigation measures, including through the Stay Safe campaign aimed at awareness raising and provision of information to refugees. As part of UNHCR's leading role in coordinating the UN refugee response, we have also deployed experts in PSEA coordinators to support the government's response in several refugee hosting countries. Mr. President, since the early days of this crisis, UNHCR committed to stay and deliver in Ukraine, and this is what we have done. Allow me to take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude and admiration for our colleagues who have remained in Ukraine, but also to the whole humanitarian community. We believe that at least 2 million people have been forced to flee within Ukraine. Close to 13 million people have been affected in the hardest hit area, hardest hit by the war in Ukraine. Many people remain trapped in areas of escalating conflict and, with essential services disrupted, are unable to meet even the most basic of their needs. In many locations, such as Mariupol, residents face a critical and potentially fatal shortage of food, water, and medicines. People living with disability or serious medical condition are particularly impacted. UNHCR is closely tracking negotiation for safe passage and is preparing to send humanitarian supplies as soon as conditions allow. To facilitate the provision of life-saving assistance to the population most in need in Ukraine, we have adjusted our operational presence, relocating offices and warehouses to the western and central part of the country. Together with partners, we have been able to deliver critical supplies for displaced and conflict-affected populations, including core relief items and shelter materials. We're working closely with local authorities to establish and expand reception capacity in main locations where internally displaced people arrive. We coordinate the provision of key protection services such as legal aid, social accompaniment, psychosocial support, child protection, and gender-based violence case management. Where conditions allow, we distribute multi-purpose cash to help people make choices best suited to their needs. Flexible forms of assistance are crucial, as are innovative approaches. Despite all efforts, we are unable to respond to the sheer scale of the rapidly growing needs of the Ukrainian people and systematically deliver the much needed life-saving assistance. We cannot overemphasize the urgent call repeatedly made by the Secretary General, USG DiCarlo, ERC Griffiths. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. International humanitarian law must be upheld, and safe passage for civilians in any direction they choose must be enabled. Safe humanitarian access to those in need and unhindered delivery of aid, including through a functioning humanitarian notification system, remains of paramount importance. Mr. President, in conclusion, allow me to paraphrase High Commissioner Gandhi, who is today in Tajikistan after having left Afghanistan yesterday. On numerous occasions, he stressed that as we respond to the crisis in Ukraine, we cannot abandon or forget other recent and protracted humanitarian crises in many regions of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Thank you.
أشكر السيد مازو
I
على
thank Mr.
إحاطته.
Mazu for his briefing.
أعطي الكلمة
I now
الآن
give the floor
للدكتور تدروس
to
أدهانوم
Dr.
غيبرييسوس.
Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address it today. The war in Ukraine is having a devastating consequence for the health of Ukraine's people, consequences that will reverberate for years or decades to come. There is severe disruption to health services and access to basic commodities as a result of widespread destruction of infrastructure, including health facilities. WHO has verified 43 attacks on healthcare, with 12 people killed and 34 injured, including health workers. In any conflict, attacks on healthcare are a violation of international humanitarian law. They deprive people of urgently needed care and break already strained health systems. The disruption to services and supplies in Ukraine is posing an extreme risk to people with cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, HIV, and TB, which are among the leading causes of mortality in Ukraine. Displacement, poor shelter, and overcrowded living conditions caused by the conflict are likely to increase the risk of diseases such as measles, pneumonia, and polio. Services for mental health and psychosocial support are urgently needed to help people cope with the effects of the war. There are more than 35,000 mental health patients in Ukrainian psychiatric hospitals and long-term care facilities, which are facing severe shortages of medicines, food, heating, blankets, and more. The war is also exacerbating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ukraine. With just 1/3 of the adult population fully vaccinated, this increases the risk of large numbers of people developing severe disease. Critical shortages of oxygen will have an impact on the ability to treat patients with COVID-19 and many other conditions. At least 8 facilities for producing and storing liquid oxygen have now closed. And we're seeking ways of accessing oxygen from neighboring countries and ways to deliver it safely to where it's needed. WHO is on the ground, working with the Ministry of Health and partners to support health workers and the health system to provide care to meet immediate health needs. So far, we have sent about 100 metric tons of medical supplies, including oxygen, insulin, surgical supplies, anesthetics, and blood transfusion kits, enough for 4,500 trauma patients and 450,000 primary healthcare patients for 1 month. Other equipment, including oxygen generators, electrical generators, and defibrillators, have also been delivered, and we're preparing to send a further 108 metric tons. We have now established supply lines from our warehouse in Lviv to many cities of Ukraine, but challenges with access remain. We need unfettered access. We have critical supplies ready for UN joint convoys to enter difficult areas, but so far we have not been successful. Today, for example, the UN convoy to Sumy that included a WHO truck carrying critical medical supplies was unable to enter. Loads ready for Mariupol remain in staging areas and cannot proceed. Access to this and other areas is now critical. To support Ukraine's health system, WHO is coordinating the deployment of 20 emergency medical teams consisting of experts from many countries to deliver care across a range of disciplines in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which have been generous in welcoming refugees but are struggling to meet their needs, as my colleagues earlier said. Those needs are immense and include continuity of care for basic illnesses, as well as more complex issues like cancer and renal dialysis, maternal and child health, HIV and TB, sexual and reproductive health, and mental health. Refugees and many of those who remain in Ukraine are already very vulnerable, especially women and girls. Protecting them from abuse and exploitation of all kinds must be a top priority for hosting governments and for all international organizations. Mr. President, today I have 3 urgent requests. First, we urge the Security Council to work for an immediate ceasefire and a political solution. Prolonged conflict is in nobody's interest and will only prolong the suffering of the most vulnerable. The life-saving medicine we need right now is peace. Second, we urge all donors to support the response to humanitarian needs in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which are immense and escalating every day. Thanks to donors who front-loaded WHO's contingency fund for emergencies, we were able to respond immediately, deploying these funds were supplemented by additional funding from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF. However, to sustain the response, we call on donors to fully fund the United Nations Emergency Appeal. As the Undersecretary General said, it's only 36% so far funded. We thank those donors who have already pledged funding to meet the needs of people in Ukraine. And third, although Ukraine is rightly the focus of the world's attention, I urge you not to lose sight of the many other crises in which people are suffering. In Afghanistan, more than half the population is in need, with widespread malnutrition and a surge in measles, among many other challenges. In Ethiopia, the blockade of 6 million people in Tigray for almost 500 days has created a catastrophic food and health crisis. In the Syrian Arab Republic, more than 12 million people are in need of health assistance, almost half of them children. And in Yemen, roughly 2/3 of the population, more than 20 million people, are estimated to be in need of health assistance. Mr. President, in every case, the only solution is peace. I repeat, in every case, the only solution is peace. And our world needs peace more than ever. As if COVID is not enough, to have a devastating war like this is dangerous for the world. I thank you, and back to you.
أشكر الدكتور غبريسوس على إحاطته. أعطي الكلمة الآن لأعضاء المجلس الراغبين في الإدلاء ببيانات. أعطي الكلمة لممثلة الولايات المتحدة.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the briefers for your briefing today. Just 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable, full-scale invasion into Ukraine and assault on democracy. Now over 3 million refugees have fled the country, creating a devastating humanitarian crisis felt around the world. These refugees are mostly women and children. They stuffed their lives into backpacks and left their homes and everything they knew behind. Today, many of them know that their apartment buildings and streets have been bombed to rubble. And the horrors continue for those who remain in Ukraine. We just heard from the WHO DG that 43 hospitals have been attacked by Russia. 43 hospitals and health facilities. AP reporters on the ground showed the world a mass grave in Mariupol, a narrow trench filled with the bodies of children. Yesterday, Russian forces dropped a powerful bomb that hit a Mariupol theater where hundreds of civilians were hiding. The Russian word for children was written outside the theater, both front and back, in large white letters that could have been seen from the sky. Yet Russian forces bombed it anyway. Local officials have told families to leave their dead relatives lying outside on the streets, exposed to the world, because it is simply too dangerous with the bombs and shellings to hold funerals. I just met with Ukrainian civil society leaders. They reported that people standing in a bread line, trying to get food to feed their families, were shot dead by Russian soldiers. They reported terror, the terror that Russia is inflicting across Ukraine on the Ukrainian people. Russia will be held accountable for its atrocities. There's only one way to end this madness. President Putin, stop the killing, withdraw your forces, leave Ukraine once and for all. Yesterday, I listened to President Zelensky's speech to the United States Congress, and I was so moved by his words, his bravery, and his calls for help and for peace. Immediately afterward, President Biden announced another $800 million in security assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. That's more than $1 billion in the past week alone. We're not doing this by ourselves. Our allies and partners are fully committed to surging assistance to the Ukrainians. And we are grateful to all of our allies and partners who have opened their borders and their hearts and welcome Ukrainian refugees. We're also going to continue to provide humanitarian relief to support people within Ukraine and those who have been forced to flee, including the $186 million in additional assistance that Secretary Blinken announced on Tuesday. Here at the United Nations, we believe the best way to address the humanitarian crisis is through a resolution in the UN General Assembly. The resolution in the General Assembly will reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and Ukraine itself. The International Court of Justice issued a profound and important order yesterday to the Russian Federation, and we call on Russia to comply immediately. Russia has clearly violated international law by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's brutal tactics have killed civilians, medics, and some of the journalists who have been showing us all the truth of this war. Russia has attacked so much of what we hold sacred, and everything the United Nations stands for. Russia's actions must be condemned in no uncertain terms. As President Biden said, Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin. No matter what advances he makes, no matter whom he kills or what cities he destroys, Ukraine will never be a victory for him. The United States stands with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and we will do everything in our power to end this tragic, unnecessary war. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات
I thank
المتحدة
the
على
representative
بيانها
of the
وأعطي
United
الكلمة
States for her
لممثل
statement
ألبانيا.
and give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Rosemary, for your clarity and the very valuable information you provide every time you come to brief the Council. Thank you, Mr. Mazou and Director General Ghebreyesus, for your sobering information. Dear colleagues, 3 weeks into this unprovoked, unjustified, illegal, and deadly aggression by Russia, and the terrible facts are hardly surprising since anticipated nearly to the detail. Massive casualties among civilians, mass graves, widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, ruined homes, schools, and hospitals, lives blown away by bombardments, children's dreams charred into smoke. There is no need to describe this devastating situation. Yet, as we just heard, and by the top UN representatives, not by the so-called West hysteria, is soul-wrenching and coincides with the shocking media reports on the horrors of the war and the misery unleashed upon Ukraine for no reason. I will maybe just recall the summarizing words of the Secretary General when he said 2 days ago, Ukraine is in fire and is being decimated. Guess by who? Over 3 million refugees in only 3 weeks, more than the entire population of my country. Some 2 million people displaced internally, 12 million people affected in the areas hardest hit by the war. UNICEF has evidence that since the start of the war, forced by this brutal aggression, every second a child has crossed the border of Ukraine. SRSG pattern warns that abuse, risks of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as trafficking, continue to mount amid wide-scale displacement. Several appeals for humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians went unheeded. Many people remain trapped in areas of conflict and with essential services disrupted are unable to meet their basic needs, including food, water, and medicine. For the estimated hundreds of thousands who remain, there is simply nowhere to go. They can be killed even for queuing for bread, as it happened. This is the angry and the true face of the Russian aggression. Mr. President, the director of WHO that we just heard confirmed that there have been 33 attacks on Ukrainian healthcare facilities, infrastructure, and workers since the beginning of the invasion, otherwise 2 every day. There are, unfortunately, nearly a dozen conflicts in the world today. Out of 89 attacks on health system around the world this year so far, 33 have been only in Ukraine. Therefore, attacking healthcare facilities and workers is becoming a tactic of war in Ukraine. Nothing is being spared. First, there was this maternity ward in Mariupol. Then there was a mosque. Yesterday, Russians bombed the drama theater in Mariupol, a shelter for nearly 1,000 citizens who were not able to flee the city. And as it was mentioned, the word children in large Russian script was painted on the ground outside the theater. Everything must be bombed. Despite this grueling picture, the main news is not just what I said. The main news is that Ukraine is holding on, that Ukraine is resisting, that Ukraine is winning and Russia is deep in the mud. On the ground, morally, legally, and internationally. And we know now that for Russia to win this war of choice, it has to Grozny the entire Ukraine. It has to Aleppo all its cities. It has to Mariupol everything there. And even after that, we will be told here again that it's not their fault. C'est la faute à Voltaire. Mr. President, Ukraine won yesterday the first legal victory at the International Court of Justice. ICJ, the guardian of international law, ruled that there was no evidence to support Russian claims that Ukraine was committing genocide in the Luhansk and Donetsk. The court called for immediate suspension of any kind of military operations by Russia and entities, organizations, or persons under its control. So the question is, will Russia respect the court's order, or will it unplug and cancel itself completely, entirely, from the international law? Mr. President, beyond the human toll, the infrastructure and residential deliberate destructions and large-scale humanitarian crisis, there is another major crisis, the economic impact of the aggression. UNDP has warned that every day of delayed peace will accelerate a free fall into poverty in Ukraine. UNDP again projected yesterday that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war deepen. In the event of a continuing protracted war in Ukraine, almost 1/3 of the population will fall below the poverty line, and a further 62% will be at extreme risk of falling into poverty within the next 12 months. It warned, again the UNDP, that 18 years of social economic achievement could be lost. And this would set the country, an entire region, back decades, leaving deep social and economic scars for generations to come. Who in this room or outside it believes then a single word from Russia about SDGs, about Agenda 2030, because these terrible effects will not only be felt in Ukraine, but in the entire world? Mr. President, Russia has proposed a text for a humanitarian resolution. We think it is wrong. It is worst. It's a mockery of proportions, a move worth of the Guinness record of hypocrisy. Russia cannot shoot first and then come disguised as a doctor. The only way to minimize humanitarian consequences for the Ukrainian population is simple. Russia has to stop the war, withdraw its troops, and go home. No one should get confused by a text just because it is called humanitarian, when the only aim is to provide cover for the war. So colleagues, don't fall for the new clothes of the emperor. The Russian aggression is naked out there. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل ألبانيا على
thank
بيانه
the
وأعطي
representative
الكلمة
of
لممثلة
Albania
المملكة
and give the
المتحدة.
floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I join others in thanking our briefers today as well. As we've heard, it's 3 weeks since we met in this chamber to make one final effort to avert a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's 3 weeks since we were interrupted by the news that President Putin had abandoned diplomacy and chosen war. These have been 3 devastatingly long weeks for the people of Ukraine, for the 3 million people who have fled, and for those who have stayed. As we heard from the UN, Russian forces are laying siege to populated cities and towns and indiscriminately shelling residential areas with high-impact weaponry, including cluster munitions. 43 healthcare facilities, including a maternity hospital, have been attacked, killing the most vulnerable and depriving civilians of access to medical assistance. And President Putin's war is causing suffering well beyond Ukraine's borders. Thousands of students, many from nations around this table, have been caught up in the violence. The war is spiking food and energy prices, bringing further pain to countries in the developing world already suffering from the impact of COVID and famine and conflict and climate. Millions of refugees have been taken in by countries across Europe. Mr. President, colleagues, 3 weeks since the start of Russia's invasion, one point should be clear in our minds. This is an unprovoked war of aggression waged by Russia. Russia is responsible for the suffering it has inflicted on Ukraine and beyond. Russia alone can end this war. 141 UN member states have unequivocally condemned Russia's illegal invasion. The International Court of Justice has issued a legally binding order requiring Russia to suspend military action in Ukraine immediately. This week, perversely, Russia tabled a resolution that, among other things, called for the protection of civilians, including women and children. This is cynical game playing in the face of human suffering. Just yesterday, in Mariupol, Russian forces reportedly targeted civilians taking cover from the onslaught, despite the word children written on the ground where they sheltered. If Russia really wanted to protect women and children, it would withdraw its troops from Ukraine and end this illegal invasion today. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثلة
I
المملكة
thank the
المتحدة
representative
على
of
بيانها
the UK for her
وأعطي الكلمة
statement.
لممثل
I give
فرنسا.
the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie
I thank
la secrétaire générale adjointe
the
aux affaires
Undersecretary
politiques,
General for Political
le haut
Affairs,
commissaire adjoint aux réfugiés et le
Assistant
directeur
High
général
Commissioner
de
for
l'OMS
Refugees,
pour leurs
and the
interventions.
Director General of the WHO
Celle-ci
for their
démontre,
briefings.
avec l'impartialité
These
et la rigueur
briefings
qui
reveal with the
caractérisent le travail des
impartiality and the
Nations
rigor
Unies,
that the United
la
Nations is
réalité
known
de
for in
cette
its
guerre
work, the reality
menée
of this
depuis 3
war
semaines
that has been
par la
waged for
Fédération de
3
Russie.
weeks now by the Russian
Cette
Federation.
réalité,
The
c'est
reality
la mort de civils
is the
innocents,
deaths of
ainsi
innocent
que de
civilians as
journalistes
well
et de
as
personnels
journalists
médicaux.
and medical personnel.
C'est le chaos créé partout en
It is the
Ukraine
chaos
et
created
bien
throughout the
au-delà,
country and
notamment
well
par
beyond its
l'aggravation
borders,
de
in
l'insécurité
particular
alimentaire dans le
because of the
monde.
worsening food
Ce sont
insecurity
les
throughout the
millions
world.
de vies brisées,
It's
de
the
toutes celles et tous
millions
ceux
of
qui sont
lives
forcés de fuir leur
disrupted,
foyer
of
et
those
qui ne trouvent
who were
répit
forced
ni
to
dans les
flee
hôpitaux
their
ni
homes
dans les
and who
écoles.
find no respite,
Avec
whether
ses
in
partenaires
hospitals or
européens,
in
la France
schools.
continuera de se
With its European
mobiliser
partners,
pour
France
l'accueil
will
de ces
continue to
réfugiés.
mobilize
Elle
to
continuera
welcome these
d'apporter son
refugees, and we
soutien
will
aux
continue
Ukrainiens.
to provide
Elle a
support to
débloqué 100
Ukrainians,
millions
and to this
d'euros
end
à
we
cette
have
fin. La
disbursed
France
100 million
appelle la
euros.
Russie à cesser
France
immédiatement
calls on
cette
Russia
guerre
to
sanguinaire
immediately cease its
et à se
bloody war
conformer
and
à l'ordonnance de la
to
Cour
comply
internationale
with
de
the
justice
International
rendue
Court of
hier.
Justice's order
Elle
issued
condamne dans
yesterday.
les termes les plus forts
We condemn
le siège de
in the
plusieurs villes
strongest
ukrainiennes
terms
et les
the
bombardements
siege
indiscriminés
against Ukrainian
visant les populations
cities
civiles.
and the
Elle
indiscriminate
appelle la Russie à se
bombings
conformer au droit
targeting
international
civilian
humanitaire,
populations.
à protéger les
Call
civils et les
on
infrastructures
Russia
civiles
to abide
et à
by
permettre
international
l'acheminement de
humanitarian law
l'aide.
to protect
Les
civilians and
attaques
civilian
contre les
infrastructure
hôpitaux
and to
sont
allow safe
constitutives
and
de crimes de
unfettered
guerre.
delivery of
La France
humanitarian
condamne
assistance. Attacks
également
against
les
hospitals
actions qui ont
rise
pris
to the
les
level of
journalistes pour
war
cible
crimes, and we
et elle
also
rappelle
condemn the
l'obligation qui
targeting of
incombe aux
journalists,
forces
and we
armées de les
recall the
protéger.
obligation of armed
La
forces
France
to
est
protect them.
particulièrement préoccupée
We
par
are
les
particularly
informations faisant
concerned
état
at reports
de l'emploi
of
par la Russie de bombes à
Russia's use
sous-munitions.
of cluster munitions.
Elle condamne une fois de plus
We
le
once
soutien
again
que le
condemn
régime biélorusse
the
apporte
support
à
of the
cette guerre
Belarusian
meurtrière.
regime
Elle dénonce
for this
l'utilisation par
deadly
la Russie
offensive, and
de
we
mercenaires,
also
notamment syriens,
condemn the use by
qui
the
ne
Russian
saurait
Federation
exonérer
of
la Russie
mercenaries,
de sa
notably Syrian
responsabilité. Celle-ci
mercenaries.
devra rendre
This
compte de ses crimes. Nous
is in
saluons
no
l'ouverture
way
d'une
an
enquête
absolution of
par le
Russia
bureau du
and its
procureur de la Cour
responsibility.
pénale
Russia
internationale.
must give an
La
account for
France
its crimes.
dénonce enfin
We
le séisme de la
welcome
Russie qui
the
prétend à
opening
New
of an
York
investigation by the
se
Office of the
soucier de
Prosecutor
la
of the
situation
ICC
humanitaire en
into the
Ukraine
situation. France
alors qu'elle en est la
denounces the
cause unique.
cynicism of Russia,
Le
which
projet de résolution
claims
russe
to
ne
be
trompe
concerned
personne.
at the
Il ne
humanitarian
doit pas
situation
être
in Ukraine,
soutenu.
where it
Le
is,
soutenir serait
and yet
donner
it
un
is the only one
blanc-seing à la
responsible.
Russie pour qu'elle poursuive cette guerre. Monsieur le Président,
If we
malgré les
support their draft
destructions et les
resolution,
souffrances,
it should be giving
la
them the
guerre en
green light to
Ukraine
continue their war.
a révélé
Mr.
une autre
President,
réalité.
despite the destruction and
Le
suffering, the
peuple
war in
ukrainien
Ukraine
fait
also
preuve d'une
revealed another
résistance
reality.
admirable. La France salue son
The
courage
people of
et
Ukraine
celui des
are
autorités
showing
ukrainiennes.
admirable
La communauté
resistance, and we
internationale est
welcome their
unie dans
courage
la
and
condamnation
the
de
courage of their
l'agression.
authorities.
De nombreux pays, dont la France,
The international
ont
community is
immédiatement pris
united
des
in
mesures
its
visant
massive
les autorités
condemnation
russes
of
et
Russian
les cercles
aggression, and
économiques
many
proches du
countries, including
pouvoir
France, have
pour les
immediately taken
priver
measures
des ressources
targeting Russian
et les
authorities and the
empêcher
economic circles
des
close to
moyens de
Russian
poursuivre
power
cette
to
guerre.
cut off access to their
Ces
resources
sanctions
and to
ont
prevent
déjà
them from
démontré leur
continuing this war.
efficacité et
These sanctions have
continueront à être
already proved
renforcées pour
effective and
enchérir
will be
le
further
coût de la
strengthened
guerre
to
jusqu'à
make
ce que
it
les
more
autorités russes
expensive to
renoncent à la
wage this
violence.
war and
Je vous
until
remercie,
the
Monsieur le
Russian
Président.
authorities give up their.
أشكر ممثل
I
فرنسا على
thank the
بيانه
representative
وأعطي
of
الكلمة
France
لممثلة
for his
إيرلندا.
statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. I also would like to thank Under Secretary General DiCarlo, Assistant High Commissioner Mazou, and Director General Dr. Tedros for their very sobering briefings. Their messages are grim, very grim. We commend all humanitarian organizations working to alleviate the man-made catastrophe being visited on Ukraine. President, the cause of this catastrophe is clear. 3 short weeks ago, as we sat in this very chamber, as the Secretary General pleaded for peace, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. Since then, we have witnessed wanton devastation in a sovereign, independent nation with no regard for human life. To date, over 3 million people have had to flee Ukraine, becoming refugees in neighbouring countries. We heard today 90% of those forced out of their homes and into uncertainty are women and children. Families torn apart. At least 2 million people are internally displaced, increasingly vulnerable and in need of immediate support. Ordinary people traumatized by a cruel and reckless war. Women and girls face heightened risk of being subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and trafficking. Their right to protection is being ignored. The destruction of the basic services all of us here at this table take for granted, food, water, sanitary systems, health and education, is having a devastating effect in Ukraine. Civilian casualties, we know, are in the thousands. Irish journalist Pierre Sachevsky was tragically killed alongside Ukrainian journalist Sasha Kushnova. They were both working to shine a light on Ukraine's plight. Our thoughts are with their families and every grieving and suffering Ukrainian family. Courageous journalists are showing the horrific impact of Russian aggression. I salute the free media putting their lives on the line to show us the truth. The humanitarian impact of this war is being felt around the world. It will affect the food security of countries heavily reliant on Ukrainian agricultural products, including in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It will cause severe harm far beyond the borders of Ukraine. President, I find it a damning indictment that this Council has to plead with the Russian Federation not to deprive civilian populations of food and water, not to deny them the basic infrastructure they need for daily existence, for survival. It's a damning indictment that we in this Council have not been able to speak with a united voice to save innocent lives in this war. President, the images from a besieged Mariupol are shocking. We see once again that urban warfare takes the heaviest toll on civilians. We deplore the targeting of healthcare facilities, doctors taken hostage, life-saving care interfered with by military forces. Last week's attack by Russian forces on a maternity hospital in Mariupol plumbed new depths, resulting in the death of a mother and her newborn baby, a baby that never had a chance. We have to ask how many more. The residents of Mariupol are now melting snow or siphoning water from heating systems to quench their thirst. They're cutting down trees for firewood for cooking and to stay warm in freezing night temperatures. The city's supermarkets emptied because the basic necessities of life cannot be safely brought into the city. It is chilling to think that the suffering forced on Mariupol may be visited on other Ukrainian cities. There can be no justification for this brutal aggression. It should never have been perpetrated. It must be stopped. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations to protect civilian healthcare facilities and medical and humanitarian personnel. It must facilitate the safe passage and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, including medical and food supplies. Whatever is agreed or not agreed on humanitarian corridors or other measures, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected under international humanitarian law. This applies both to those who choose to leave and those who choose to remain. Surely, the most basic respect for human life must mean something to the aggressor even now. Let's be clear, the provision of humanitarian assistance is not dependent on a ceasefire. It is dependent on those bombing cities doing the right thing in accordance with their obligations. President, attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects, indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks are all prohibited under international humanitarian law. Ireland remains gravely concerned by the humanitarian harm arising from use of explosive weapons in populated areas in Ukraine. There have been reports of the use of cluster munitions and thermobaric weapons by Russian military forces. These weapons cause mass casualties. They pose great risk for civilians when deployed in urban areas, including long after fighting has ceased. Their use is unconscionable. Equally, any use of white phosphorus against civilians or civilian infrastructure is abhorrent and contrary to international law. President, not only is Russia's war in Ukraine morally wrong, it is illegal. Yesterday, in granting Ukraine's request for provisional measures against the Russian Federation, the International Court of Justice was clear, it was emphatic. Russia must immediately suspend the military operations in Ukraine. In light of the court's decision, which is binding on the Russian Federation, which it cannot ignore, Ireland once again calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law and immediately end its aggression, unconditionally withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threat or use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. President, colleagues, for 3 long weeks, diplomacy has proved unavailing. For 3 long weeks, the world has watched this war with horror. Yet, we believe there is still a chance for peace. We urge the Russian Federation to do the right thing and commit to the diplomatic path in good faith. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة إيرلندا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة النرويج.
Thank you, President. I join others in thanking briefers for their sobering presentations. 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its military aggression and invaded Ukraine. And since the start of the war, a Ukrainian child has become a refugee almost every second. Over 3 million civilians have crossed the borders into neighboring countries seeking protection, and over 2 million people are displaced inside Ukraine. They are fleeing from the horrors of Russia's unjust and illegal war against Ukraine, from the destructive power of one of the world's biggest war machines, from Russia's shelling of homes, schools, and hospitals, from Russia's indiscriminate use of explosive weapons and their deplorable use of cluster bombs, weapons that destroy cities, killing civilians even while they are fleeing or hiding. The human suffering is unacceptable. We encourage countries to keep their borders open to all those seeking safety outside Ukraine without discrimination. And we commend the generosity of the neighboring countries and their solidarity with those fleeing the war. Many of those fleeing are in a vulnerable situation, as we heard from Dr. Tedros, at risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. Traumatized children and adults in need of mental and psychosocial support. We encourage the humanitarian organization to give priority to these issues in their response. President, civilians must be protected at all times, and humanitarian and medical workers must also be protected and allowed safe, rapid, and unhindered access to people in need. The protection of civilians and humanitarian access are not a matter of choice. They are legal obligation under international humanitarian law, obligation which must be respected. And those responsible for violation must be held accountable. President, Russia's war is causing despair and suffering with global implication. Russia is responsible for the increased food prices and higher risk of food insecurity that many countries now face. Russia's war against Ukraine will further exacerbate humanitarian crisis, death, and disaster for people across continents. Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for the war and humanitarian crisis. Russia must stop its military aggression against Ukraine. Russia must comply with the order by the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend its military operation in Ukraine. If Russia cares about the humanitarian suffering this war is causing, then Russia should stop its senseless and illegal war. The Russian draft resolution has no credibility. It will not stop the war and the suffering. We echo the call of the Secretary General that political dialogue, negotiation, and mediation are the only way forward. We need to see genuine talks that translate into concrete results on the ground, and they must be inclusive. We need to see women included meaningfully in all talks, negotiation, and mediation efforts. And for the sake of humanity, this war must stop. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة النرويج على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل الهند.
I think the representative from Norway and India has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank USG DiCarlo, UNHCR Assistant High Commissioner Mazzo, and WHO Director General Dr. Ghebreyesus for their respective briefing on the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the ongoing situation, which has progressively deteriorated since the beginning of the hostilities. The conflict has resulted in death of civilians, displacement of thousands of people internally, and outflow of more than 3 million refugees to neighboring countries. The humanitarian situation has worsened, particularly in the conflict zones. There is an urgent need, therefore, to address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the UN and its agencies who have mobilized whatever is possible in the shortest possible time frame. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs of the people of Ukraine, including through extending generous support to Secretary General's flash appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan on Ukraine. Keeping in view the dire humanitarian situation unfolding in Ukraine, India has already sent over 90 tons of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors as a part of the 9 separate tranches of humanitarian assistance delivered thus far. These supplies have included medicines and other essential relief material. We are in the process of identifying other such requirements and sending further supplies in the coming days. India has ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. Allow me to underscore that it is important that the humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of hostilities across Ukraine. Our Prime Minister has reiterated this on several occasions and called for immediate ceasefire and emphasized that there is no option but the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We stand ready to continue to engage on these objectives in the Security Council as well as with the parties in the coming days. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الهند على بيانه وأعطي
I
الكلمة
thank the
لممثل
representative of
غانا.
India, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana. The representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and also thank the distinguished briefers for the updated information on the prevailing humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I also welcome the participation in this meeting of the representatives of Poland and Ukraine. Mr. President, Ghana reiterates once more the call on the Russian Federation for an unconditional and immediate ceasefire and for the withdrawal of all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. The cessation of hostilities is critical to save lives and prevent further devastation to the Ukrainian people. It remains fundamental to addressing the worsening humanitarian situation. We remain deeply concerned about the military escalations and the disproportionate use of unconventional munitions in bombarding the cities and civilian populated areas of Ukraine, and we are disheartened by the trauma that the situation has caused, especially to the aged, women, and children. The parties to the conflict must urgently commit to a humanitarian pause to enable the evacuation and safe passage of civilians and facilitate the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to those in critical need and those who have been caught up in the cities under siege. We also deplore the attacks on medical facilities and call for the protection of humanitarian workers and medical personnel. We urge the parties to comply with their commitments under international law and international humanitarian law, in particular, the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 relating to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of diplomacy and dialogue in resolving their security concerns. We believe that the good offices of the Secretary General should be leveraged to facilitate a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, In concluding, I wish to emphasize that the interest and safety of the Ukrainian people should be prioritized and must be at the forefront of the actions of this Council and all other international actions. I thank you for your kind attention.
أشكر ممثلة غانا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة
I thank the
لممثل
representative of Ghana,
غابون.
and I now give the floor to Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame
I'd like to
DiCarlo,
thank Madame
le Docteur
DiCarlo,
Tedros Adhanom
Dr. Tedros
Ghebreyesus
Adhanom
et
Ghebreyesus,
Monsieur Raoul Mazou
Mr.
pour
Raouf
leurs
Mazou
exposés
for
sur
their
la
briefings
situation
on the
humanitaire en
situation,
Ukraine.
the humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
L'intensification des combats et l'exode massif des populations civiles qui en découlent, la détérioration des conditions de vie et des conditions sanitaires de ceux qui décident de rester, les risques de maladies liés à la rupture de fourniture des services publics de base sont autant de sujets de préoccupation. Nous exhortons à nouveau toutes les parties à respecter les dispositions du droit international humanitaire, à garantir le respect et la protection des populations, y compris des ressortissants africains, ainsi que des infrastructures civiles, du personnel médical et des travailleurs humanitaires. Nous réitérons l'urgence d'ouvrir des corridors humanitaires sécurisés et appelons à l'arrêt immédiat des hostilités. Sauver des vies doit transcender toute considération politique. Les parties au conflit doivent saisir toutes les possibilités qu'offre la diplomatie pour parvenir, par le dialogue, à un règlement négocié et éviter l'enlisement. Je vous remercie.
Avoid a stagnation in the situation. Thank
أشكر
you.
ممثل غابون على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة
I thank the
لممثلة
representative of
كينيا.
Gabon, and I now give the floor to Kenya.
Mr. President, I thank the briefers for their presentations this afternoon. Kenya is gravely concerned that 3 weeks on, the armed conflict in Ukraine has continued unabated. The continuing reports of loss of lives and displacement and separation of loved ones, including through millions of refugees in just 3 weeks, is deeply disturbing. Kenya extends its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflicts and stands in solidarity with all the affected. We commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities. And we urge them to continue ensuring that protections sought are offered with no discrimination on any basis, and particularly in regard to race or religion. Kenya condemns the targeting on and destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure, particularly residential homes, hospitals, and shelters. The parties are obliged to comply with international humanitarian law. We remind that civilians, including foreign nationals in Ukraine, are not party to the conflict and must not be a target. In this regard, all actors, including the parties, must consider to prioritize the safety and interest of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law. The imperative to ensure that humanitarian passages are open and functioning in all times cannot be overstated. We believe that there is an urgent need for humanitarian resolution that reflects the unity and the resolve of this Council to assist the people of Ukraine. Ultimately, the only way out of this crisis is an immediate and unconditional cessation of the military campaign. We urge the parties to do this to allow humanitarian assistance to flow and create room for diplomacy and constructive dialogue, including through the good offices of the UN Secretary General, towards a sustainable political solution. We underscore the need for an urgent resolution of this armed conflict. Its impact is already being felt through increased food prices, fertilizer, oil, and other essentials by multiple countries. If it is not quickly prevented, this trend, including the added effects of unilateral sanctions, will aggravate state fragilities and fuel ongoing conflicts across the world, especially in the global south. In closing, Mr. President, Kenya restates its recognition of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
أشكر ممثلة كينيا على بيانها وأعطي
I
الكلمة
thank the
لممثل
representative of
البرازيل.
Kenya, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank for their briefings Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, the WTO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Mr. Raouf Mazou from UNHCR. As the conflict in Ukraine lingers on, the dire humanitarian situation in the region is further deteriorating. Brazil is deeply concerned with the growing number of civilian casualties, including children, as well as the increasing flows of refugees and internally displaced people. According to some estimates, the number of people impacted by the conflict is around 18 million, of which more than 6 million are internally displaced and nearly 3 million people have fled Ukraine. The destruction of infrastructure has caused food shortages, energy outages, and intermittent communications. Under these circumstances, supply chains have been disrupted. The access to medical facilities is impaired. Medical supplies are running low, their distribution is uncertain, and some stockpiles are out of reach due to military operations. Hospitals and medical personnel are struggling to provide care to the sick and wounded. In response to the most pressing needs for humanitarian assistance, the Brazilian government has sent last week a donation encompassing water purifiers, around 9 tons of foods, and half a ton of medical items, totaling approximately 20,000 items donated by the Brazilian Ministry of Health. With the assistance of the Embassy of Brazil in Warsaw, the supplies were landed at that capital and delivered to Ukraine in coordination with the country's authorities. The international community must come to the assistance of the people most in need, not only those directly afflicted by the hostilities in Ukraine territory, but also refugees in the neighboring countries. We commend the World Health Organization for its work to ensure the delivery of health supplies to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. The availability of medical personnel, medicines, and health equipment is crucial to meet the urgent needs of those sick and wounded. At this moment, Ukraine's health system is under critical pressure to cope with the demands for assistance from the many victims of this conflict. It is distressing to know that as of 12 March, the World Health Organization had verified 31 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine, resulting in dozens of deaths and injuries, including health workers. The attacks against healthcare are particularly worrisome since they deprive people of life-saving services. Attacks on healthcare are violations of international humanitarian law. We reiterate our position that the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine is the main condition to guarantee the passage of civilians from conflagrated zones to safe areas. Moreover, only with a comprehensive and effective ceasefire it would be allowed the rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance to those in need. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل البرازيل على بيانه وأعطي
I
الكلمة
thank
لممثل
Brazil, and I now
الاتحاد
give the
الروسي.
floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин
Thank you,
председатель.
Mr. President.
Мы внимательно
We
выслушали
listened
наших бриферов.
very carefully to our briefers.
Разделяем
And we
озвученные
share the
озабоченности ООН
concerns
гуманитарным
voiced
кризисом,
by the
который
UN on the
гуманитарным
humanitarian
кризисом,
crisis,
который
which
разворачивается в
is
ряде регионов
unfolding in a
Украины.
number of regions in Ukraine.
На него справедливо указывают и наши коллеги
Our
по Совету
colleagues in
Безопасности.
Security Council are also rightfully pointing to it.
Однако разница в том,
But the
что
difference
оценки
here is that the
некоторых, в
assessments
частности,
of
западных
some, in
государств,
particular Western states,
базируются
are based
помимо ситуации с беженцами
in addition, above and
на
beyond the
раздуваемой с
situation
самого
with
начала
refugees
российской
on
специальной
the
военной операции на
hyped
Украине кампании
up
дезинформации,
campaign
которая
of lies and
берет
disinformation
все
in
новые и новые
Ukraine is
высоты.
reaching new and new heights, and
Вот
it
и сегодня
started
мы
at the very
услышали
beginning at the
целый
special
ряд
military operation.
подобных
Today we've heard a
сообщений
whole
из уст
slew
наших коллег.
of such information from our colleagues.
Это и обвинение в
The
обстреле, ставшего уже
accusation
нарицательным роддома в
the
Мариуполе,
shelling of the infamous now
и
maternity hospital in
бомбежки
Mariupol, and
Мариупольского
the
театра,
shelling of the
и о
Mariupol
том, что
theater,
Россия не
and the
выпускает
fact
беженцев,
that Russia is not
и о
allowing
том, что Россия
refugees to leave,
бомбила
and that
мечеть
Russia
султана
shelled
Сулеймана в
the mosque of
Мариуполе, и о
Sultan
том, что
Suleiman in
Россия из
Mariupol,
автоматического, российские войска из автоматического
and
оружия
that Russia using
расстреляли в
automatic
очередь в
weapons
Чернигове.
to shoot
Все
a
эти
bread line
фейки
in
неоднократно
Chernihiv.
опровергались. Я, во-первых, хочу
This
сказать
has
своей
been
американской коллеге,
refuted
когда она
many a
сказала,
time.
сослалась на
The
генерального директора ВОЗ,
American colleague referred to the
который
Director
якобы
General of
сказал, что
WHO, who
Россия
allegedly said
разбомбила,
that Russia
что 33 госпиталя были
33
подвергнуты бомбардировке Россией.
hospitals were
Я
bombed
хочу
by
обратить внимание,
Russia.
что
I'd like to draw
генеральный
your
директор
attention to the
ВОЗ,
fact that the Director
спросите у
General
него,
of WHO, and please ask
этих
him,
слов не говорил.
did not say
Насколько
this.
нам известно,
As far as we know,
не в правилах ВОЗ
it is not
осуществлять
within
атрибуцию
their
о том,
rules
кто
to
произвел те или иные удары по медицинским
who
учреждениям.
conducted a strike
А
against
вот
a medical
к
facility.
вопросу об атрибуции, о
Now,
том,
on the
кого
issue of
считать виновным
attribution, who
в
is
разрушении
at fault
медицинского учреждения
when
на
it comes
Украине,
to
у нас
destroying
много вопросов.
medical facilities in Ukraine,
Мы
is
еще
something
к
that
этому
we have
вернемся.
many questions about, and we'll revert to that.
В Чернигове расстрел
Now, in
очереди.
Chernihiv, the
Это было
lie
давно
in
уже
Chernihiv,
опровергнуто.
this
Российских
has been
военнослужащих в
refuted many a
Чернигове
time
нет.
ago. There are no
Это
Russian
все,
military in
скорее всего,
Chernihiv.
последствия
I
бездумной
think
раздачи оружия
this is a
кому
consequences
угодно на
of
Украине.
just distributing
Хочу
weapons
сказать,
to
что
whoever wants to
было
have
за
them
это
in
время,
Ukraine.
помимо
During
других
this
видов вооружения,
time,
было
in
роздано
addition to
населению
other kinds of
бесконтрольно
weaponry,
25 тысяч автоматического оружия.
25,000 pieces of automatic weapons had been distributed to
Мечеть,
population at large.
мечеть
Now, the mosque,
султана Сулеймана в
the
Мариуполе.
Sultan Suleiman Mosque in Mariupol,
Президент фонда мечети
the
султана
president
Сулеймана
of the fund
в
of the
Мариуполе
mosque
опроверг
Sultan Suleiman Mosque
сообщение о том, что турецкая
Mariupol
мечеть с 80 мирными жителями была
refuted the
обстреляна
fact that
российскими
the
войсками.
Turkish mosque
Так
with
что я не знаю,
80
кто войдет в
people
книгу
was
рекордов Гиннесса по
shelled
цинизму, но я
by
точно
Russia
знаю,
from the east. So I don't
кто
know who will
войдет
end
по
up in
рекорду
the
фейков
Guinness
за одно заседание
Book
Совета
of Records, but I
Безопасности.
do know who will hold the record on
Книгу рекордов
fakes voiced during one single meeting of Security Council. That will be a Guinness Book record.
Как я уже говорил, своего
As I
рода символом,
already said,
работающим
a sort of
сейчас на полную
symbol
мощность
of
западной и украинской фабрики фейков,
the fabric manufacturing fakes
стала ситуация в Мариуполе
by the
вокруг него.
Ukrainians and the
Хочу пояснить для
Westerners
тех,
are
кто
the
не знает,
situation
в
in
чем
Mariupol
особенность
and
этого
around
города.
this city. Well, let me explain to you why this place is special.
В ходе событий
In the course of events in
2014-2015 годов, когда
2014-2015,
украинская
when the
военщина бросила
Ukrainian
на
warmongers
несогласных с новой
threw
майданной
against
властью
those who were in
жителей востока
disagreement
страны
with the Maidan
самолеты
authorities,
и
those who
танки,
lived in the east of the country, it threw planes and tanks against them.
Мариуполь был
At the
одним из
time,
главных
Mariupol,
центров
one of the
сопротивления в
main
Донецкой
centers
Народной
of
Республике.
resistance in the Donetsk
Его
People's
жители
Republic,
почти
and
единогласно
its citizens
поддержали
almost
независимость
unanimously
республики в
supported
ходе
the independence of
референдума,
the republic during the
активно
referendum,
выступали
and they were
против
actively
националистического киевского
speaking
режима.
out against the nationalist
Этого
Kiev regime.
украинские нацисты
And the
не
Ukrainian
забыли.
Nazis cannot forget that, cannot forgive that.
Утопив город в крови,
They
они
drowned the
превратили
city
его
in
в своего рода
blood, and they
штаб-квартиру
made it
и
in
оплот
a sort of
добровольческих нацистских
headquarters
батальонов.
and the mainstay of
Прежде всего,
voluntary
Азов,
Nazi battalions, first and foremost, the Azov battalion and the Right Sector one.
В аэропорту Мариуполя
Mariupol
находилась
airport
печально известная тюрьма пыточная со
had the
всей
infamous
соответствующей атрибутикой.
jail, which is also a torture center with all of the attributes
Рвами с
belonging
телами
thereof.
замученных,
It had the
карцеры и
ditches
бензопилы.
with bodies of people,
Это
solitary
не
confinement cells, and
средневековье, это
chainsaws. This is
неонацизм.
not even the Middle Ages, this is neo-Nazism.
Именно поэтому
And that is
украинские
precisely why
радикалы
the
так
Ukrainian
цепляются за
radicals
этот
are
город.
clinging to this
Во-первых,
city
он
so much.
скрывает
First of
множество
all, it covers
доказательств
up
преступлений.
many a proof of their crimes.
Во-вторых, они
And
понимают,
second of
что
all,
за
they
них придется
understand that
отвечать.
they will have to be held accountable for
Поэтому
this.
поэтому они
And that's
готовы
why they
утянуть за
stand
собой в
ready
могилу
to
хоть все население
drag
Мариуполя.
into the to drag into the grave almost entire population of Mariupol.
Так же, как это делали нацисты в
Exactly the
осажденном
way it was
Берлине
done
в
by the Nazis in Berlin in
1945 году,
1945 when it was
они
besieged.
удерживают
They
жителей в качестве
also
живого
hold
щита,
people as human
не давая
shields.
им
They do not
эвакуироваться
allow
и
them to
размещая рядом
evacuate, and they
с
place
жилыми
right
объектами
next to
тяжелое вооружение
residential
в нарушение
buildings
норм
heavy weaponry
международного
in
гуманитарного
violation of
права.
international humanitarian law.
Этого ни наши
And this is
западные
something that our
партнеры, ни, к
Western
сожалению,
partners and
представители
unfortunately
секретариата
the
ООН
Secretariat
упорно не
representatives
желают
is
замечать.
something they do not
Однако
persistently
правду
do not
скрыть
want
трудно.
to
Мы
see.
отмечаем
But it's very
заявление
difficult to cover
НКК,
up facts,
высвечивающее
and here
такие
we would
факты.
like to point you to the ICRC statement, which sheds light on these facts.
В подобной обстановке
In
неудивительно,
such a
что
situation,
Мариуполь
it's
стал
not a
едва ли
surprise
не
that
лидером
Mariupol
по
has
числу и
become almost a
изощренности
leader on
фейков,
the
производство
number and
которых
ingeniousness of the
является
fakes,
одним из главных
and
занятий
their manufacturing has become
украинского
almost a
режима.
main job of the Ukrainian
Выделю
regime.
тройку
And let
самых
me just
шокирующих из
dwell
них.
on the three most
Первый
egregious
это,
of them. And the first one, of course,
безусловно,
is
бывший роддом
the
Мариуполя, якобы
former
разрушенный
maternity
российской
hospital in
ракетой.
Mariupol, allegedly destroyed by the
Не
Russian
буду
missile.
на нем
I'm
подробно
not going to dwell on this too
останавливаться.
long.
Мы уже об
Let
этом говорили.
me just simply say that we
Мы
covered
изложили
this
данную
earlier,
информацию в
and
письме
this
на имя генерального
information is
секретаря ООН.
something that we put into a
Сложно
letter sent to
найти
the
разумное
Secretary General.
объяснение тому, что
It
наши
is very
западные коллеги
difficult to find a rational
решили не
explanation for the
только
fact that
не
our Western
замечать наше
colleagues decided
заблаговременное
not only to
предупреждение
notice a warning in advance,
о том,
the
что
warning
роддом
we
давно превращен
issued,
в огневую
telling
точку
everyone
украинских
that the Rodom
националистов.
had become a
Но
military firing
неоспоримые
post for the
данные о
nationalists.
постановочном
They also
характере,
ignore the
устроенном
irrefutable
там в
fact
лучших
about the
традициях белых
staged
кассок
nature
фотосессий,
of the situation there,
равно как и мнение авторитетных
along the
баллистических
lines of what
экспертов
was being done by
о
the
том, что в
white
здание ничего не
helmets.
попадало,
And they
а
also
имел место подрыв.
ignoring the opinion of ballistic experts who say nothing hit the building, but rather there was an explosion there.
О втором
The
фейке мы
second
услышали в том
fake is
числе
something
сегодня от
that we
наших западных
heard
коллег.
about today also from
Россия
our
якобы
Western
нанесла
colleagues.
удар по
Russia
Мариупольскому
allegedly hit
драмтеатру,
the
где
Mariupol
укрывалось
theater,
более
where
1000
more
человек.
than 1,000 people had sought refuge.
На самом же
In
деле,
actual
еще
fact,
13
already on
марта
the
в широком
13th of
доступе
March, there
частным
was
лицам была
widely
опубликована
available
информация,
public
полученная
information
от жителей
provided
Мариуполя,
by private
чудом
people in
вырвавшихся из
Mariupol who
города,
managed miraculously to
что
escape the
Азов
city. They
удерживает
were
в этом
saying that
здании
Azov is holding
огромное
in that
количество
building a
людей и
huge
готовит
number
кровавую
of people
провокацию.
and is preparing a bloody
Не
provocation.
случайно поэтому это нас не
There,
удивляет, что
we
там было написано слово
therefore
«дети».
are not surprised by the fact that in front of the building you can see the word children
Вооруженные силы
written
России
down
были
on
информированы
soil.
о ситуации.
The Russian armed
Да и
forces were informed
изначально
about the
здание
situation,
театра не
and the
расценивалось
building
российскими
of the
войсками
theater
как цель
was
для
never
авиаудара.
considered as a target for a strike.
Своевременное же
But the
нахождение в
fact
местах подобных
that
провокаций
in such
западных
places, such
журналистов,
places of
рапортующих о
provocation, you
случившемся,
can very frequently find
уже
Western
становится
reporters who briskly
трагической
report
приметой
on that.
происходящих
And
на
this is
Украине
something that's become a
провокаций,
tragic hallmark of
покрывающих
provocations
беззаконие
in
со
Ukraine,
стороны
who are covering
ВСУ
up
и
the
нацбатальонов.
excesses conducted by nationalist battalions and Ukrainian armed forces.
После того, как маховик западной пропаганды разгоняет по
Western
мировым СМИ
propaganda
трагическую
efforts
фотографию
to
мужчины, потерявшего
make
жену
sure that the mass
из-за
media
удара
throughout the world show a
ВСУ
picture
ракетой
of a
.у
person who had
с
lost his wife
кластерными
because
боеприпасами.
of the Ukrainian strike by .u with cluster ammunition
По центру Донецка,
against the center of Donetsk.
выдавая происходящее
And this is
как сцену из
presented
Киева.
as something that had taken place in Kiev.
Призывать вас к какой-то объективной
After
оценке
that,
сложно.
it's very difficult for us to ask you
Еще раз
to be
напоминаю, что
rational
никто
in
из
your
вас,
assessment.
из
Once
западных
again,
СМИ,
let me
не сказал ни
recall
слова о
that neither
трагедии в
one
Донецке,
of you
унесшей
or Western
жизни
mass
более
media said
20 мирных жителей.
anything about the tragedy in Donetsk, which resulted in 20 deaths of civilians. And the third fake. Now, Russia allegedly is forcing the people from Mariupol and other Ukrainian towns into Russia. Therefore, only humanitarian corridors into Ukraine should be opened. This is a barefaced lie. Since the beginning of a special military operation, the hotline of the Ministry of Defense of Russia received more than 2.5 million requests. requests for being evacuated into Russia. Unfortunately, we have to state that we have not been able to evacuate everyone yet, but this is because the Ukrainian authorities are prohibiting people from doing that. But during the previous 24 hours alone, from the finally opened up long-suffering Mariupol, we managed to ensure the evacuation of more than 31,000 civilians, including 89 foreign nationals, amongst whom 71 OSCE staff, 9 Greek nationals, and 9 Pakistani nationals. Out of the 31,000 evacuees, only 36 people moved to the Kiev-controlled territories in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The rest of them opted for Russia and in the areas of Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast under the control of the Russian armed forces, and categorically refused to move over to the territories under Kiev control. The whole humanitarian operation was conducted by the DNR forces and Russian armed forces without any participation from the Ukrainian side. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the car jam at the exit of Mariupol of people moving towards Berdyansk and Melitopol, freed from Ukrainian Nazis, is 10 kilometers long. Until Russian liberators entered the city, this is not something that was seen, and this is not a surprise because the peaceful civilians were needed by the Nazis as a human shield. And those who escaped from Mariupol are telling us about mass atrocities and crimes conducted by the territorial defense, but the abuses against the elderly, women and children. And all of these people are being individually provided with medical and psychological assistance. The situation in other areas varies. Yesterday, we have fully complied with the quiet guns regimes along the humanitarian corridors proposed the Ukrainian side and the Kiev, Zaporozhye, Zhytomyr, Sumsk, Kharkovsk, and Poltav directions. And this has been many times confirmed by the means of objective control, including with the use of drones. On the humanitarian corridors open towards Russia, neo-Nazis were not allowing people to go, and they threatened them, and those who managed to break through were being shot at. Yesterday, in the Kharkov direction, once again, there was a column of buses full of refugees. They're moving along the humanitarian corridor towards Russia. It was being shelled. As a result, 4 people died and they're injured. But despite all of the difficulties and all of the impediments, during yesterday alone, without the participation of Kiev, we managed to evacuate from dangerous areas 12,440 people, out of them 2,242 children. Overall, since the beginning of special military operation, already 271,000 people, out of them 58,000 children have been evacuated. They have crossed the border of Russia. This includes 31,000 individual cars. And we stand ready to take even more. In subjects of Russian Federation, we have more than 9.5 thousand points of temporary housing. In the liberated territories, we create all of the conditions to make sure that those who want to can accede to the humanitarian assistance, which remains in many places the only possible means of survival. The medicines, clothes, and food which are received from international organizations, in particular from ICRC, is something that the mayors of Ukrainian cities resell to local entrepreneurs. These facts have been reliably established in Zhytomyr, in Ivano-Frankivsk, in Vinnytsia, in Rovno, in Lutsk, in Dubna, in Vladimir-Volynsk, and in Lvov. Hostages, basically hostage of the territorial defense battalions, are 6,910 of foreign nationals from 22 states. Also, crews of 70 foreign ships are blocked in the seaports of Ukraine because there's a very high danger of mines. And this was created by Kievan authorities in their internal waters and territorial sea. And this also is related to the possible provocations by the Ukrainian armed forces from the shore. We continue sending humanitarian assistance to the needy in Ukraine. And Mariupol alone received more than 450 tons of food, medicines, and basic necessities. Overall, starting with the 2nd of March, our emergency services and the Ministry of Defense supplied to various regions of Ukraine, including Donbass, supplied about 3,000 tons of humanitarian cargo, including construction materials. Another issue here is that in a number of cases, the local administrations are threatening punishment to those who receive Russian humanitarian assistance. And against this, basically every day we see information from Western capitals that they are providing Kiev with yet another cargo of all kinds of weaponry. Yesterday, Washington announced that this week Ukraine will receive from them defense assistance to the amount of $1 billion. You are fueling this conflict, pouring oil into it. It is already clear now what kind of tragedy resulted from simply distributing light weapons to anyone who wanted them without any control. I wonder whether the Western taxpayers know about the risks of this weaponry ending up with the terrorist groups in Europe, portable air defense weapons, for example. Do you understand how dangerous it is to fuel the situation in Ukraine, how dangerous it is for your own security? Everyone has heard about the drone which landed in Croatia. It was full of explosives. It was not noticed, even though it crossed over several countries from the western point in Ukraine to Zagreb. That's more than 700 kilometers. Mr. President, we note with regret Ukraine has always was a pawn in the geopolitical struggle against Russia and remains such a pawn still. Western politicians couldn't care less about the suffering of the people in Donbass, including women, children, and the elderly. If this were not the case, we would not be now dealing with a salacious uproar surrounding the draft of humanitarian resolution on Ukraine. After its draft was developed by France and Mexico, it stopped being humanitarian immediately and became full of political formulas which have nothing to do with humanitarian issues. As we were clearly told, the Western countries didn't need this project without them at all. In order to end up with an anti-Russian product, they are ready to push it forward, not in the Security Council, but in the General Assembly, ignoring the fact that this kind of document will help humanitarians nothing. And that is why Russia put forward its own draft containing within it everything that the humanitarians need. It does not contain political assessments, and this is not the kind of assessment that you can find in other humanitarian resolutions either. And we open this document for the co-sponsorship by all UN members. But we are being told that the humanitarian resolution submitted by Russia
западные страны не устраивают.
Is not something that satisfies Western countries.
Это выдает истинные цели
наших
спонсоров первой гуманитарной, так называемой гуманитарной резолюции Совета. И это как раз является настоящим лицемерием.
And that is true hypocrisy here.
Еще одним цинизмом является то, что на нас выходят коллеги из многих делегаций и жалуются на беспощадное давление и выкручивание рук со стороны западных партнеров, вплоть до экономического шантажа и угроз. Соединенные Штаты и Албания распространили письмо, в
члены ООН призывают не
members
спонсировать
of
нашу
the
резолюцию.
UN are appealed to refrain from sponsoring our
Мы
resolution.
понимаем,
We do
как этим странам не
understand
просто
how
противостоять этому натиску.
difficult it is for those countries to
По
withstand this kind of
по
onslaught.
этой причине мы
And
приняли решение
therefore,
пока
we
не
decided
запрашивать
to,
голосование
at
по
this
нашему
stage, not to
проекту,
ask for a
но
vote on
проект
our
резолюции
draft,
мы не
but
отзываем.
we are not withdrawing the draft
А
resolution.
вместо этого завтра
Instead,
утром мы
tomorrow morning,
запросим
we
срочное
will ask for an
заседание, чтобы
emergency
обсудить,
meeting
вновь
to
обсудить
discuss
тему
again the
биолабораторий
issue
США на
of U.S. biolaboratories
Украине с
in
учетом
Ukraine
новых
using the
документов,
new
попавших
documents
нам в
we
распоряжение в ходе
obtained in the
специальной
course
военной
of the
операции.
special military operation.
Прямо сейчас
And right now,
направим
we
соответствующее
are
письмо
going to
Эмиратскому
forward the letter
председательству.
on that
Благодарю
to
вас.
the Emirati presidency. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد
I
الروسي على
thank the
بيانه
representative of
وأعطي
the Russian
الكلمة
Federation for his statement
لممثل
and give
الصين.
the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席先
Thank you,
生。
Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
我感谢迪卡洛
I
副
thank
秘书长、
USG DiCarlo,
谭德赛总干事和
Director General
马祖助理
Ghebreyesus,
高专
and Assistant High Commissioner
刚才所
Mazu
做的通报。
for their briefings just
中
made.
方对乌克兰人道局势的不断恶
China
化
is
深
deeply
表担
worried
忧。
about the
对有
worsening
关平民
humanitarian
伤亡
situation in
增加、
Ukraine and
难民人
deplores
数
the
增加的
reported
报道
increase in
感到
civilian
痛心。
casualties and refugees.
当务之急是要呼
The
吁各
pressing
方
task
保
now
持最大
is
的
to call
克
for
制，
maximum
保
restraint
障
from
妇女、
all
儿
parties
童在
and
内
to
的所
ensure
有
safety
平民
and
安
security
全
of all civilians,
和
including
基
women
本
and
人道
children,
需求，
and meeting their basic
防止发
humanitarian
生更
needs
大规
so
模
as to
的
prevent
人
the
道危机。
occurrence of a larger
中
scale
方支持有
humanitarian
关当事
crisis.
方保持
China
沟通，
supports the work
确
by
保
the
人
relevant
道走
parties
廊
in
安
maintaining
全畅通，
communication,
继
ensuring
续
safe
为
and
人员
unimpeded
撤离
humanitarian
和人
corridor,
道救
and
援
further
提供便利。
facilitating personnel evacuation and
当前冲
humanitarian
突造成
assistance.
的难民和流离失所
The
者
number
人数
of
仍
refugees
在
and displaced
增加，
persons caused by the conflict
对
is
乌克
still
兰
on
和
the
周边
rise,
国家
bringing
造成
huge
巨
impact
大
on
冲击。
Ukraine and the surrounding
中方
countries.
支持联合国
China
人道协调
supports
办公室、联合
OCHA,
国难民署、世
UNHCR,
卫组织等
and
机构，
WHO, among
积极开
others,
展行
in
动，
actively conducting
动员国
operations
际社会
and
向
mobilizing
所
the
有有
international
需要的
community
人
to assist
提供救
all
援。
those in need.
前段时间，
In the recent
一
past,
些非洲裔、
some
中
people
东裔
of
人
African
员
or Middle
在
East
撤离过
descent
程中遇到
encountered
困难，
difficulties during
应当引起
evacuation.
重视，
This
并予
should be
以妥
taken
善解决。
seriously and addressed
所有难
properly.
民，
All
无论肤
refugees,
色、
regardless
种
of
族、
color, race, or
宗教信
religion,
仰，根据国际难
shall
民
be
法，
accorded
都应
the
获
necessary
得必要
protection
的保护。
under international refugee law.
中方高度重视乌克
China
兰人道
pays
局
high
势，
attention to the
提出
humanitarian
了
situation
6
in
点倡议
Ukraine
主张
and。has put forward a 6-point
中国红十
proposal.
字会
The Red Cross
已经向
Society
乌克
of
兰提
China
供
has
3批
provided Ukraine
援助
with
物
3
资，
batches of
其
humanitarian
中
supplies,
第3批物
with
资
the
包
third
括
one
儿童奶粉
containing
和棉被等，
milk powder and
重
quilts
点
for
帮助乌
children,
克兰红十字
specifically
会
helping the
救
Red
助
Cross
受冲
Society
突
of
影响
Ukraine
的流离
assist
失所儿
displaced
童。
children affected by the
我们
conflict.
欢迎各方提
We
出的
welcome
任何有
any
助于缓解
initiative or
和
proposal
解
from
决
any
乌克兰
party
人道危
that
机的倡
contributes
议
to
和举措。
alleviating and resolving the
安
humanitarian
理会
crisis
肩
in
负负责
Ukraine.
国际
The
维护
Security
国际和
Council
平与
bears the
安全
primary
的
responsibility
首
for
要责任，
maintaining international peace and
应当为
security
缓解
and
乌
should
克兰人道
therefore
局
play
势
a
发
positive
挥
role
积极
in
作用。
easing the humanitarian
中
situation
方期
in
待安理
Ukraine.
会
China
能
hopes
在人道
that
问
the
题上
Council
保持
can
团
stay
结，
united on the
体现
humanitarian
建
issue
设性态度。
and demonstrate a constructive
主席先生，
attitude. Mr. President,
国际社会普遍希望
the
尽快实
international
现停
community
火，
shares the common
缓解
aspiration
现地
for
局势，
ceasefire at an
避
early
免
date
平民
to
伤亡。
alleviate the situation
这
on the
也
ground
是
and to
中方
prevent
的期
civilian
待。
casualties. This is also the
目
aspiration
前
of China.
俄罗斯
To
和乌克
date,
兰已经举
Russia
行
and
了
Ukraine
4轮
have held 4 rounds of negotiations. Keeping the negotiations going means there is a chance for ceasefire and that there is a chance for a peaceful future. China remains committed to promoting peace through negotiations. We support the UN and the parties concerned in vigorously carrying out good offices. We also hope that all parties will do more to facilitate peace talks and not to add fuel to fire. Facts have proven that wanton use of sanctions will not solve any problem, but will instead create new problems. Given the sluggish recovery in global economy, ever-escalating sanctions are undermining stability in international industrial chain and supply chain, thus exacerbating food and energy crisis, damaging people's livelihood in all countries, developing countries in particular, and triggering new humanitarian consequences. This is also an issue that the Security Council shall pay attention to when addressing the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الصين على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل المكسيك.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you very much,
señor presidente.
Mr. President.
Agradezco a la secretaria general adjunta
Rosemary DiCarlo,
al subcomisionado para operaciones de la ACNUR, el señor Masou, y al director general de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, el doctor Ghebreyesus, por sus presentaciones. Han transcurrido 3 semanas desde el inicio de la invasión rusa a Ucrania y el saldo es realmente devastador. Hemos escuchado cifras trágicas. Más de 3 millones de refugiados y cerca de 1.8 millones de desplazados internos. Son números exorbitantes, sobre todo si recordamos que hace exactamente un mes estábamos sentados en esta misma sala evaluando la implementación de los acuerdos de Minsk. Y en esa sesión, por cierto, se nos dijo que lo que ocurría en el terreno eran solamente ejercicios militares. ¿Cuál es entonces la perspectiva humanitaria si continúa el patrón que ha imperado hasta ahora? Quiero empezar por reconocer la disposición solidaria de todos los países que han recibido refugiados, especialmente aquellos quienes han asumido el influjo más numeroso. Pero las necesidades de las personas que no han podido salir o no han logrado ser evacuadas de las áreas urbanas acosadas han aumentado y seguirán creciendo, especialmente aquellas que no tienen acceso a servicios básicos, agua potable, alimentos o medicinas. Resulta pues imperativo garantizar el acceso seguro e irrestricto del personal humanitario, del personal de salud. Son los únicos que pueden brindar esos servicios básicos a la población civil. Señor presidente, como hemos escuchado, la Organización Mundial de la Salud ha registrado 43 ataques a instalaciones médicas en Ucrania. Y el hecho incontrovertible es que atacar instalaciones sanitarias está expresamente prohibido por el derecho internacional humanitario. Urge entonces garantizar que se respeten las más de 300 instalaciones médicas que se encuentran a lo largo de las líneas del conflicto o dentro de ellas. Deploramos también los ataques contra el personal de salud, así como de sus medios de transporte o del equipo que requieren para poder operar. Las consecuencias a corto y a largo plazo de estas acciones sobre la población civil y en contra de los sistemas de salud pueden en efecto ser irreversibles y por eso mismo son inadmisibles. Reiteramos nuestro llamado a cumplir con las resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad en la materia, la 2286, que incluye menciones específicas a la protección del personal sanitario y humanitario, y la 2573, que se refiere a los bienes civiles considerados como indispensables. En el mismo sentido, encontramos la decisión emitida ayer por la Corte Internacional de Justicia, en la que se ordena la suspensión inmediata de las operaciones militares que comenzaron el pasado 24 de febrero. Como lo hemos reiterado ante este Consejo, la premisa fundamental para la asistencia humanitaria es el cese de las hostilidades. Señor Presidente, en tanto que las Naciones Unidas y diversos actores humanitarios concentran sus esfuerzos en proveer la ayuda urgente que la población necesita, es oportuno reiterar también que la única solución a este conflicto será por la vía del diálogo y de la diplomacia. Reconocemos las iniciativas en curso, incluyendo el reciente encuentro en el marco del foro de Antalya. Cualquier intento genuino de negociación debe ser bienvenido. Por ello lamentamos que a pesar de nuestros esfuerzos genuinos de buena fe en los que hemos estado activos en estas 2 últimas semanas junto con Francia y otros estados cuya participación constructiva mucho agradecemos, no haya sido posible aún que este Consejo haga un llamado inequívoco al cese de las hostilidades. Un llamado en este sentido por parte del Consejo sería el mayor apoyo humanitario que pudiera recibir la población civil en Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
أشكر ممثل المكسيك على بيانه. أدلي الآن ببيان بصفتي ممثل الإمارات العربية المتحدة. أشكر كل من السيدة روزماري ديكارلو والسيد راؤوف مازو والدكتور تيدروس غيبريسوس على إحاطاتهم الوفية. ما استمعنا إليه اليوم يعكس التدهور الخطير للأوضاع الإنسانية جراء استمرار الصراع في أوكرانيا، حيث تواصل أعداد اللاجئين الارتفاع بوتيرة مثيرة للقلق، كما تستمر معاناة المدنيين في المناطق الأوكرانية بسبب العراقيل أمام وصول المساعدات الإنسانية مثل الغذاء والمعدات الطبية وغيرها من الاحتياجات الأساسية. وفي الوقت نفسه فإن الضرر الذي لحق بالبنية التحتية المدنية سيفاقم من تردي الوضع الإنساني في المدن الأوكرانية الرئيسية لا سيما ماريوبول. وفي هذا الإطار تود بلادي التركيز على 4 نقاط رئيسية. أولاً، أننا ننظر بإيجابية تجاه المفاوضات الجارية بين الاتحاد الروسي وأوكرانيا، ونأمل أن تسفر عن تهدئة تسمح للمنظمات الإنسانية بأن تقوم بمهامها وأن تلبي احتياجات المدنيين. وفي هذا السياق هناك ضرورة ملحة لاتخاذ خطوات ملموسة تهدف لتهدئة الأوضاع على الأرض وبناء الثقة بين الطرفين، بما في ذلك عبر التوصل لاتفاقات تمكن المنظمات الإنسانية من إيصال المساعدات للمحتاجين بطريقة آمنة، وإنشاء ممرات لخروج المدنيين، والتوصل لتفاهم يضمن حمايتهم. ثانياً، تثمن بلادي الدور الرئيسي لدول الجوار، وبالأخص بولندا ورومانيا ومولدوفا، بالإضافة لغيرها من الدول في التعامل مع الأزمة الإنسانية من خلال استقبالها للاجئين وتوسيع شبكة الأمان الاجتماعي لتراعي احتياجاتهم. وفي الوقت نفسه ندرك من تجارب منطقة الشرق الأوسط أهمية دعم هذه الدول لتتمكن من رعاية اللاجئين بشكل كامل، خصوصا وأن الصراع ما زال قائم مما ينذر باستمرار موجات اللاجئين. ثالثا وبالتزامن مع جولات التفاوض الجارية تشدد بلادي على أهمية الالتزام بالقانون الدولي وبالأخص القانون الإنساني الدولي والذي يمثل خرقه ليس فقط انتهاكا لحقوق المدنيين بل تهديدا للنظام الدولي. ونكرر هنا دعوتنا لجميع الأطراف المعنية إلى احترام التزاماتها الدولية ووقف استهداف المدنيين والبنية التحتية المدنية. وأخيرا تؤمن دولة الإمارات بضرورة أن تركز استجابة مجلس الأمن للأزمة الإنسانية الناتجة عن الصراع في أوكرانيا على العمل الإنساني بطريقة عملية وهادفة، وذلك بالتنسيق مع مكتب تنسيق الشؤون الإنسانية والجهات الإنسانية الأخرى ذات الصلة. ونؤكد بأن الحل الوحيد للأزمة يكمن في تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية والوقف الفوري للأعمال العدائية في جميع أنحاء أوكرانيا والسعي إلى سلام مستدام يحفظ استقلال وسيادة أوكرانيا وسلامة أراضيها ويعزز الأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة والعالم. أستأنف مهامي كرئيس للمجلس. طلبت ممثلة الولايات المتحدة الكلمة لإدلاء ببيان آخر. أعطي لها الكلمة.
Thank you very much. I was momentarily pleased to hear that the Russians were pulling down the vote on their farcical humanitarian resolution, which was doomed to fail. We know if Russia really truly cared about humanitarian crises, the one that it created, it could simply stop its attacks on the people of Ukraine. But instead, they want to call for another Security Council meeting to use this council as a venue for its disinformation and for promoting its propaganda. Let us not forget that Russia is the aggressor here. They are the ones that are creating a pretext for attacks on their own people, and we can't be fooled by their efforts here. They have troops inside of Ukraine. They are killing people inside of Ukraine. That is the reason for us being here today, not to deal with their propaganda. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات المتحدة على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة الآن لممثل أوكرانيا.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, Director General, Assistant High Commissioner, I also recognize the representative of the aggressor state present here in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Let me begin with a quote. "The operation is developing successfully and in strict accordance with plans that have been previously approved." End of quote. Said by Putin yesterday, 3 weeks after the unprovoked and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine started. Over these weeks, the international community was wrestled with the question, why? Why has the Russian Federation decided to cosplay the Nazi Third Reich by attacking the peaceful neighboring state and plunging the region into war? What are the reasons and what is the plan? And yesterday we got the answer. Killing Ukrainian children, 108 innocent souls so far. Let me quote again, "Success in the strict accordance with the plans approved previously," according to Putin. Children are deliberate target, given yesterday's bombardment of the Mariupol drama theater, a shelter for hundreds of local residents, mostly women and children, despite the big signs children painted on the road on both sides of the building being clearly visible, Russian pilots dropped an aerial bomb. The building was fully damaged, but the shelter fortunately withstood. It did not turn into one of more mass graves, as Putin's plan probably envisaged, previously approved. Of course, Putin's plan does not limit murders to children only. All civilian Ukrainians and foreign citizens are under threat. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 726 confirmed cases of killing of civilians, while believing that the real figures are considerably higher. And they are indeed. Just yesterday in the city of Chernihiv, 53 civilian residents were killed by Russian bombs and shells. On the same day, in Merefa, Kharkiv region, 21 people were killed following Russian shelling that destroyed the local school and residential buildings. The plan is also to raze Ukrainian cities to the ground: Kharkiv, Sumy, Volnovakha, Akhtirka, Izium, and Mariupol. Pain for Ukraine and the entire world, and an eternal shame for Russia. Almost 2,400 confirmed victims among the civilian population. 90% of the city's infrastructure has been destroyed. Russian troops seized one of the hospitals, gathered 400 civilians there, and used the building as a military position, hiding behind civilians as a human shield. Let me quote, "The sufferings of Mariupol must not become the future of Ukraine," end of quote, said by Peter Maurer, the ICRC president, who is currently in Ukraine. The plan of Putin is to violate the agreements on ceasefire and safe passage for the civilian population from the temporarily occupied territories. Yesterday, Russian troops shelled a convoy of civilian vehicles headed from Mariupol to Zaporizhzhia. 5 people were killed, many injured, including children. And the plan is previously approved: to terrorize local residents who remain in the territories seized by Russian troops. Small villages where the Russian soldiers stay suffer the most. Russians break into houses, throw people out into the streets, take their food. Eyewitness reports of tortures, abductions of local officials, and even extrajudicial killings come from across the occupied territories. Enforcing Ukrainians to flee their homes as refugees has also been a part of this Barbarossa-style plan. Almost 3.2 million refugees have left Ukraine so far. Against the backdrop of the increasingly aggravated humanitarian situation, Russia has dared to table a draft humanitarian resolution of the Security Council. An appeal by a serial killer to the UN members to co-sponsor this most egregious hypocrisy is outrageous. They may like to think twice if they want before they dive into the blood of children and adults executed by the Russian military in Ukraine. And let me quote St. Patrick in this regard: "Never trust a dog to watch your food." At the same time, there is no doubt that action on the humanitarian front in the UN is urgently required, and I encourage all responsible nations to support the relevant efforts in the General Assembly. I also encourage all to join the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, co-founded by Albania, Colombia, Denmark, the Marshall Islands, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. This group will act as a forum among UN member states for the discussion and promotion of accountability measures in Ukraine following the Russian military aggression. Distinguished members of the Security Council, yesterday, the International Court of Justice delivered its order on provisional measures in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. The court ordered that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on the 24th February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. Despite the order being binding on Russia under the UN Charter, today the Kremlin has openly and blatantly disregarded it, stating that they, and I quote, cannot take this order into account, end of quote, because there is no, I quote, agreement between the sides, end of quote. And should it be surprising for us? I don't think so, as from the very first instance of Russia's presence in the UN, it was in contempt of the UN Charter. That was the case when Russia was allowed to occupy the Soviet seat in the UN and the Security Council. That was the case in Georgia, in Syria, as well as in Ukraine's Crimea and Donbass in 2014. I encourage the Security Council members to exercise their duties envisaged by the Article 94.2 of the UN Charter to make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken in the case of Russia's failure to comply with the obligations incumbent upon it under the judgment rendered by the court. Mr. President, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, although known as PITS, is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Its symptoms are caused by being an active participant in causing trauma. Sufferers of PITS may be found in many roles, such as soldiers or executioners, where they are expected to cause trauma, including death. But diplomats, especially here in the United Nations, especially here in the Security Council, compared to the more well-known and understood PTSD, there appears to be greater severity and different symptom patterns for those affected by PITS. The case of the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine and the mass atrocities perpetrated by the Russian army, ordered by Putin, and defended by the Russian diplomats, will be examined by scholars and scientists, including in the areas of sociology, history, philosophy, psychiatry, and theology. Today, however, I would like to quote from Into the Abyss, a documentary about executioners of the death penalty. One guard began crying and shaking uncontrollably when, I quote, "the eyes of all the inmates he had executed began flashing before him," end of quote. Ambassador, do the eyes of Ukrainian children, women, and elderly killed by the Russians flash before you? If they do, we may consider how to sponsor a decision to help you deal with perpetration-induced traumatic stress. But now have some decency and stop the egregious manipulation of the Security Council. It is obscene. It would be too much dignifying for the Russian delegation if I ended like here, like that. Instead, I would like to quote a tweet by Dario Franceschini, the Italian member of the government, who tweeted today, "Italy is ready to rebuild the theater in Mariupol. The Cabinet of Ministers has approved my proposal to offer Ukraine the resources and means to rebuild it as soon as possible. Theaters of all countries belong to the whole humanity," end of quote. And I thank you.
أشكر ممثل أوكرانيا على
I thank the
بيانه
representative of
وأعطي
Ukraine for
الكلمة
his statement
لممثل
and give
بولندا.
the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, distinguished members of Security Council, I would like to thank Undersecretary General and the briefers for their important interventions today. And I shall start by paying tribute to the fearless Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who defend their homeland, freedom, and the UN Charter. They fight also for those who were forced to flee. I should also express gratitude to the work done by the UN OCHA, UNHCR, WHO, and its partners for maintaining their presence across Ukraine and continuing to deliver the assistance. Excellencies, the Security Council has gathered here today to discuss the fastest growing humanitarian and refugee crisis since the Second World War, the consequence of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. In light of this, I would like to stress the following points. Firstly, this is 100% a war of choice, and the methods of waging it is also the matter of choice. It is Russia that decided to refer to brutal force, indiscriminate weapons, as well as brutal siege tactics. Now they go as far as targeting journalists and kidnapping mayors of Ukrainian cities. In other words, the aggressor decided to change the nature of this conflict. It is a clear manifestation that Russia deliberately chose to create a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and bluntly disregards all the principles of international humanitarian law. And this should worry us all. Actually, disregarding the international law has been a pattern that Russia pursued in Syria and other places. To underpin this approach, earlier today the Kremlin has rejected an order by the International Court of Justice under the United Nations highest court to cease its attack on Ukraine. Secondly, without resolving the dire humanitarian situation, there will be no peace. Therefore, we urge Russia to change its military modus operandi and allow full and unimpeded humanitarian access and relief to those in need. The safe passage of civilians from different cities affected by the conflict must be allowed. Take the situation in Mariupol, where still around 350,000 residents remain trapped in the city as food, water, and medicines continue to dry up. These people require urgent humanitarian assistance and are exposed to safety and security risks. Therefore, we call for immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access to most affected areas. Thirdly, the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing war are not limited to Ukrainians in their own home territory. Those who had fled remain affected too. Already more than 3 million were forced to leave Ukraine as a result of Russia's military aggression. We have already reached the number of over 1.9 million people who crossed our border since February 24th. Most of them found a shelter in Poland. We have registered already 170 nationalities on our border. That means it considers us all, and we are all the victims of this aggression. Excellencies, as a neighbor and close friend of Ukraine, we see firsthand the dramatic humanitarian consequences of this war. Every day on the Polish-Ukrainian border, we are witnessing a growing number of people who cross the border severely traumatized. We believe that the involvement of UN bodies and agencies experienced in dealing with this kind of needs, together with the continued efforts of the Polish authorities, will bring rapid and appropriate solution. In the spirit of solidarity, Poland will continue to admit and provide shelter, food, healthcare, and safety to every person in need, regardless of their nationality, race, or religion's creed. Aside from the institutional care, thousands of Polish people are organizing in a bottom-up way, showing the solidarity with Ukraine, opening their homes to refugees, and volunteering at reception centers. Excellencies, as I'm delivering this speech, Poland's president's spouse, Agata Kornhauser-Duda, is building up an international coalition of first ladies and highnesses and all the peoples of goodwill to effectively protect those in vulnerable situations, namely women, children, elderly persons, and persons with disabilities, many of them with post-traumatic disorder. The Polish government has urgently implemented new immigration measures for Ukrainian citizens fleeing their country. The new law that took effect on Monday legalizes the stay of citizens of Ukraine in order to enable them to take up employment and provide them with healthcare, education, and accommodation in Poland. It also offers temporary financial help to Polish citizens who welcomed refugees in their homes. Ukrainian citizens may apply for one-time subsidy to answer their basic needs. The government will allocate funds for schooling of Ukrainian students. Every Ukrainian citizen fleeing the war has been guaranteed the access to the public healthcare system in the same way as Polish citizens have. We will continue to provide assistance to Ukrainian citizens fleeing the horrors of war brought on them by Russia. And I can tell you already we got 45,000 of pupils subscribed to Polish schools from Ukraine. But we and the other countries of the region, which I see the ambassadors here in the room, we all need urgently an assistance of international assistance in these good deeds. Excellencies, today Ukraine pays a high price for defending its independence, territorial integrity and democracy and UN Charter. The determination and courage of Ukrainian people inspires the world. We cannot fail them. It is crucial to show our solidarity with Ukraine and its people by acting now, and I thank you.
أشكر ممثل بولندا على بيانه.
Representative of Poland for
لم
his
يعد هناك أسماء
statement.
مدرجة
There
على
are
قائمة
no more
المتحدثين.
names on my list of
رفعت
speakers.
الجلسة.
The meeting is adjourned.
Militarize Ukraine, to denazify it, and to make Ukraine a neutral state which is not threatening Russia.
But you know, why stop fighting
But the
until that's achieved?
negotiating are going on.
What evidence are you going to bring tomorrow on chemical and
We
biological
have additional
weapons?
information on that, and I think it deserves new information, that it deserves being discussed in the Security Council. And that's not a joke, that's not a Russian propaganda, because more and more people in the West, including US and UK, are asking questions on that military bio programs that US was conducting in Ukraine, and not just in Ukraine. That applies to many US-sponsored laboratories around the world.
Mr. Ambassador, the Secretary General said that nobody will win this war. Everybody will lose. Do you believe that is true?
Well, let's see.
Are you planning to use biological weapons? No, same to you. You can't. You need to.
fuel on fire.
Yeah, nobody should, but who is putting fuel on fire except the Russian army?
But so you think what? Improvement on the end of this horrible war.
Professor, could you stand behind that tape so that all the cameras can...
Hi, all right. Are you still paranoid with COVID? No. Anyway, tell me. Any improvement? No, there is no improvement. The actions of the Russian Federation continue to be very brazen, and the atrocities are taking place every day, unfortunately.
Tomorrow, the President of the United States is going to speak with the leader of China, because he's going to ask that China is not going to help. No. The question is, from what the Chinese ambassador said today, what is your
Do I look like a Chinese spokesperson? I don't. Thank you.
Is your president going to speak to the General Assembly?
Can I ask you, after many weeks of putting questions to me, can you identify yourself, please?
Dulcie Leinbach from Pass Blue.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes. Is your president going to speak to the General Assembly?
When the time comes, he may. All right. Have a good day. Goodbye.